Tim, I have had so much fun these last couple of weeks talking about Agile and predictive and all that stuff. So why don't you kick us off today? I think we'd like to learn a little bit more, discuss a little bit more about maybe comparing the two different methodologies.
I think that would be brilliant, Merv. Let's do it this way. Let's walk through just not a hypothetical project, but let's walk through the process groups in order to see how they differentiate. But one of the things that I want us to talk about is the fact that even though they are really different, the sense about projects and project management stays the same. There's that continuity between the two. And that's the story I want to give you. So once upon a time, back in the early 1990s, I was a young engineer. I was brought into a transportation company to help them start up an IT help desk. And we were upgrading 23 buildings in New Mexico. And my director was the supervisor. But he was the project manager of all our projects. And he said, "Look, guys, I'm not going to be able to do this. Each one of us is going to be a project manager, and we're going to pull our project teams from each one of the buildings." Now, we don't know what this looks like, but we're going to go ahead and do this. And every morning before we start, we're going to have a call. And at the end of one of these buildings being done, and each one of you guys has about 2 or 3 buildings, we're going to have a review and see what it looks like. And then we're going to basically learn from each other, and then we're going to be able to put together a schedule. So in effect, he was actually putting us through an Agile project, multiple releases, relatively uncertain work and unknown work. All we had was about 5 pages from corporate headquarters, and they were indecipherable. So we built our plan based on hypothesis and understanding the technology, and it worked real well. In fact, it shaped the direction of the group for the next 5 years.
So without even knowing that there was such a thing as Agile, you basically, you and your colleagues came together in a human way of approaching a problem and solving it. And it just so happens that now that we're getting better about our project management methodologies, it kind of harkens back to just what humans do as a natural course of events.
Exactly. Isn't that a wonderful, wonderful way to think about it? It's about being human beings, knowing how to address the unknown and uncertain in such a way that we can actually get into the work early, pull out the components of the work that we need to understand, and then use constant communication and feedback in order to gain what we need to know. Yeah, it's exactly what you're saying. It's all about being human.
So if I can draw an analogy from that, or maybe a kind of a retrospective on that whole thing, is, does that mean that project managers, having gone through and built this incredible predictive process, that we are not human? Or maybe we're superhuman?
Well, you know what it is? It's still good practice.
It is.
It's still very good practice for certain types of work, nuclear facilities, construction, anything that requires an intense amount of control, oversight, and guidance that you have a good handle on, and you're willing to invest in a very rich plan where the benefits come out of it. I think predictive will always be the winning methodology there.
Well, and I think there's, and I don't want to say there's not discipline in Agile, because clearly there is, but I think with predictive, you do force a discipline on the process so that you don't move to the next phase or the next iteration until you're really comfortable with where you've ended up with. But
yeah, and that really comfortable comes from inside the project with the experts and team, and also outside the projects with the stakeholders. Business preference and organizational requirements seem to also drive the need for predictive.
Yeah. Well, and people like people like to know where we're going. Agile seems, I mean, even though it's much more of the human kind of experience being Agile, there seems to be something a little loosey-goosey about it, perhaps, which doesn't have to be. Obviously, you can put a huge amount of discipline in that, but there's something about Predictive where you can see the entire Gantt chart laid out, and there's something about having your project in place and your resources planned and all that kind of stuff that gives that comfort, especially to those of us who are more logically inclined as project managers, I think.
You're right. You're right. And I don't want to dwell on this,
Yeah.
but predictive is not for that method, that mindset. It's a mindset for, you know what, we're willing to step out into the unknown. We're willing to walk in the water where we don't see the bottom because we have to.
Yeah.
And that's where Agile really sits well. And there is an overlap, and the overlap is in the comfort and the experience of the people playing in those areas.
So you started off a little bit earlier in terms of like framing this discussion, perhaps, and talking about what some of these process groups that are common to both Agile and Predictive are. And start maybe a way of starting the discussion so that we know kind of how we're approaching it.
And that's true. And in both the 6th edition and 7th edition of the PMBOK, both Predictive and Agile are framed quite well. You have to go into the standard itself in the back of the PMBOK 6th edition, but it plays it out really well. Let's go through the process groups first. First, there's initiating, where you're gaining project approval, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we go into planning, which is developing some sort of a set of actions or direction or work that actually is in line with what you discovered in initiating. And then you have the work that the team's doing and the support work that the project's manager's doing in the executing process group. And then we have the monitoring, controlling, which inspects and tests and captures the information, turns data to information to reports. And then we have closing. Those are the 5 process groups, and they're identical in both methodologies.
So in the Agile, I take it that the 5 are, well, let's leave closing out for a second, but I take it that the 4 end up being in Agile, they're just more iterative, just faster, they're just encapsulated.
They can, but also they can have established milestones, and we'll get into that. There is a sense that there's an agreement that we have a project in Agile, just like we have a project in Predictive. But the problem is that project may be research or exploration.
Oh,
and that investment in exploration is still a commitment. It's still an obligation that we're saying we need a data center, or half of our building just collapsed and everything's all right, but what do we do now? Yeah. And how do we get into that work quickly and early in order to manage it?
So I guess me coming from 40 years of living in Predictive, and I worked for some very, very solid companies that had project management methodology as their core. So when we went and bid jobs, we definitely had these 5 stages or 5 process groups absolutely nailed. So let's begin with the initiating one. And that typically, in my experience, we ended up with a couple of major aspects to that. One is to create kind of the project charter, which gave us our overall marching orders, kind of maybe even a gross level budget. And then we also began to, in that process, identify the stakeholders that we would be working with so that we could kind of begin to bring together what that project might look like 6 months down the road, 12 months down the road, 2 years down the road, whichever it was. So basically project charter and identifying stakeholders is how I recall what we used to do a lot in the initiating group.
And that's true. And that's true. In fact, in consulting, there's 2 different activities that are happening in initiating. You're learning how to engage with your client or the stakeholder, and you have that internal discussion. Do we really want to invest in this project or not? The contract is going to be the outcome of the first, and the charter is going to be the outcome of the second. That chartering document can be client facing, but at the same time, by necessity, there has to be some agreement to move forward internally before you really invest in engaging with the client.
No, that's exactly right. In fact, because I was on the bidding side of the vendor house, a lot of that project charter and identifying stakeholders happened within the client organization before they even let the RFP out, the request for proposal, for us to propose. So at this point, we as an outside vendor were not really that much involved. We were kind of waiting for the request for our proposal to come out so that we could respond. But how does that, what we just talked about in terms of charter and stakeholders, how does that kind of play into the Agile world?
So Agile is still looking for the same thing.
Okay.
Real quickly, let's take it into a more broad context. An organization or an executive or somebody with authority says, I have a problem I need to solve. And so there is some framing, whether that organization or executive or manager does it, or whether they assign it to a project manager. There has to be some statement that says, here's the sense of the problem. You know, we have a problem down on the factory floor. We don't really understand it, but you know, it has to do with safety, and they're moving a tool around, and I want you to go down there really quick and figure out things. And that's where we have something that actually comes even before a project charter. Do you remember in the 4th and 5th edition of the PMBOK where they had a project statement of work?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, it was a narrative description of the project, and that's what we're talking about. It actually has been reincarnated in the 7th edition and in other content put out as a project overview statement. And that's actually used as a document that says, here's the big picture, here's our why, here's our purpose. Now, how can we actually frame this? And that's where between the 5th and the 6th edition of PMBOK, they took that project statement of work and they pointed it inside the business case. So the business case in the 6th edition was the all and only that contributed that content. But now with Agile, you say, you know what? We may have a more broad need or objective or problem that we need to explore. So let's go ahead and have that document, even though it's a little rough, as our chartering document. We're willing to invest people and time, even though we don't have a lot of details.
Yeah, and I can see where that makes sense. I can see also where in the predictive one, that same statement of work or project statement became a little more refined because the people who were either letting out a contract or a request for proposal for an outside vendor or putting together a statement of work for their inside IT shop, they wanted to fence that in because they only had a certain amount of budget. They only had a certain amount of staff that they could lend to the engagement. So that project charter became very, very important in the predictive process because they knew that this would set the tone for the next several months or even years.
And let's not say anything wrong. It doesn't mean that an Agile project cannot have a charter.
Gotcha.
What it means that the project overview statement can be the driving document. There can be a reason behind that charter that needs commitment and obligation. And that's what the project charter represents. We have consensus. We have people backing us that say that this is so important that we're willing to invest people and time and money in it.
All right, so now we've got our charter, and I think in Agile you also would have spoken, if I had let you, you would have also spoken to the fact that we would have stakeholders identified as well up front. I suspect that's what happens as well, because you certainly need a program sponsor or a program champion or whatever the term is in the Agile framework, but you certainly need someone who will own that product.
Right. That's correctly right. And you may have a high level estimate of schedule and budget too. It's going to be a rough order of magnitude. We're going to talk about, D to the second, basically 100% off, and it's still usable for us to say we need work. It's bigger than a bread box and smaller than a bus, and we agree that this is a worthy investment.
So having looked now at the initiating part, now let's take a look at the planning aspects. And it's interesting to me that, and I haven't finished, by the way, we're only a couple of weeks into version 7 of the PMBOK, but having read thoroughly and studied and applied version 6 many times, the PMBOK 6, the planning aspect, the planning process group seems to have the highest number of actually individual processes that one goes through in terms of developing the plan for the whole project. So from my experience, again, as a planning person, this is where you set up your entire project master plan or project management plan, some people call it. From there, you do your work plan, your estimates, you begin to develop your resource plan. And then there's a whole bunch of other plans that I, as a project manager, like to put in. Things like my communication plan, stakeholder engagement plan, quality plan, several plans. So the whole planning aspect, before I even got into the work, was a very important part in the predictive methodology. What's the equivalent on the Agile side?
So where the plan is a success in predictive, the relationship is the success in Agile. It's not that the planning goes away. It's that we create a team charter that says, here's how we're going to work with the stakeholders. Here's how we're going to work with ourselves. And there's actually a stakeholder charter too. It's not called a stakeholder charter, but you're building a culture with the stakeholders. And once you have a team, and these guys are generalized experts, so they're comfortable with, working with people and talking with people and doing surveys, that you actually have a way to go out and start interacting with them. Now, we're still looking at scope, schedule, cost, and we're still looking at quality and risk and communications and stakeholders and team and all that stuff, right? That doesn't go away. But what does happen is in planning and Agile, we say, okay, let's not worry about requirements. Let's just get to the big picture of things. And we're not going to get technical because we want to get into things that the users can relate with, because the users are going to give us the objective, the needs, and the processes that we need to either incorporate, add, or change. Basically, that's what we're looking at. And it's not just, it's not just that we're looking at creating something for the end of the project. That's our objective thing. That's our destination. But at the same time, we're creating this big picture of here's how we're working together, plus here are the big general pieces. So you could actually call it phase planning instead of feature planning or planning package planning. But we're not getting into requirements at all. We're just defining big pieces of work by objective, by need, and by role and use cases.
So this may be one area where we start to diverge. Not that we diverge a lot, but this is one area where I think there's a distinct difference between the predictive and the agile. Because in predictive, we like to start with our requirements. And I know from my own experience, with a good base of requirements, and especially if I'm bidding a large job, I like to go into the bidder's library and see exactly what they're thinking of in terms of the as-is models. Perhaps the customer has gone ahead and done a little bit of to-be work. And so as I look at those things and I take a look at the full set of requirements, I begin to develop my estimates, which then goes into my work plan, which then goes into my project management plan, which then kind of sets the course for my entire project. And that may be one place where we truly are different between predictive and agile, I'm thinking.
Yes, you are establishing a firm stick in the sand.
Yeah.
Where I'm defining something that's going to go on the water. We're going to pull ropes and sticks together and we're going to weave them. But one of the things we need to weave these sticks and ropes together with is the idea that it may fall apart in the ocean. And so we're not just going to have to plan that. We're going to have to plan to train our people and also be ready to rebuild the sticks and ropes while we're out on the sea. Now, you may get to that from a predictive manner. We may get to that from an agile manner. It's not so different.
Well, we predictive people like to have our everything in a row. So our sticks and ropes to make that raft are going to be very solid, or we hope they will be.
Yeah.
And I can tell. Go ahead.
Oh, finish. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, and I can say that there's in my bidding experience, and this goes over a career of 40 years. In that bidding experience, I bid areas where I was very, very familiar with the domain. So I could bid fairly precisely all the way through the end of the project. There were other times when I didn't know the domain quite as well. And so what we would do is we would bid solidly, say for the first phase, say the planning phase, and maybe the requirements portion of the execution phase where we do the requirements gathering. I might have a good solid estimate for that. And then much like Agile, much like you described earlier, kind of an order of magnitude for the design, the development, the testing, and the implementation further on. So there was always that aspect of the predictive planning and creating of the work plan.
Were you back when you were learning about project management, were they still teaching PERT and GERT charts?
PERT a little bit, but we got into Gantt charts very quickly. Mm-hmm. Gantt seemed to give a nice picture, a nice flow of how the different tasks the precedence was built into that. So it was a more comfortable model for people like myself than even the PERT charts.
Yeah, PERT and GERT are actually activity on arrow charts.
Yeah.
And program evaluation and review technique and graphical evaluation. And they are probabilistic in nature. That means you may have two arrows from one activity to another, and one is weighted 60% and another is weighted 40%. And so you have the ability to actually determine these things. It's deterministic as you progress through. And I'm wondering in the next 5 to 10 years if we'll see a renaissance in the adoption of PERT and GERT.
There may be, because I think what I just described in the second process of my bidding experience, there was something, and I think you gave me the term a little while ago. It wasn't one that I was familiar with in terms of terminology. It was one that I was familiar with in terms of practice, but it's the whole idea of rolling wave.
Right.
Of estimating and
right. And again, you can do this really well in predictive. We did it with our data centers because people were looking at spending $30 million and they were happy to spend $45,000 to $60,000 for a charter and $400,000 for a plan. And so that each one of those would say, let's not talk about, the end of the story. Let's talk about this part and plan it out precisely. And then the results of that will give us a better way of handling the next part of the project.
Yeah. Now, I will say this, that in my experience also, when I left corporate and created my own consulting single shingle firm, one of the privileges I had was to go in and see how the sausage was made. In other words, I was hired by the client organization to help them put together the request for proposal that people like myself in my previous life would then bid to. So I got to see how the client put together not just their project charter, but a little more detail and actually refine the requirements, detail the scope a little more directly so that the bidder could respond more accurately, and then laid out other requirements such as this is our architectural framework, these are the kinds of people we need, and that sort of thing. So it was a great eye-opening process for me to see it from that perspective and be part of that, and then actually also be there when we selected the vendor who responded to our request for proposal. So, but again, the whole idea of predictive was all of that planning, even the client organization put together before we even brought the vendor on board, who then did their own planning.
Right.
Yeah.
And yes, in fact, I was brought in as a financial and business analyst who was doing the same thing that you were doing. Basically, I'd be brought in as an advocate for the client who was trying to make these decisions, and they were working with the PwCs and the Deloitte Touches and all those guys. And the sausage making was fascinating. I got to sit at the seat of about 35 Fortune 200 corporations and watch how executive decision making was done. It was an incredible education.
Oh, it was. And just to see these very brilliant people put together their thoughts was an education unto itself.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
Do you think we should move on to execution and monitoring, or do you think?
That's what I was thinking. So
Okay.
executing, you'd think, is going to be a little different. So go through execution, a day in the life of a project manager in Predictive.
Well, and here I think there's a major departure between Predictive and Agile, because typically what we begin with is a detailed requirements gathering process where we bring in the client's subject matter experts and begin to take what they gave us in their project charter or their the more defined sort of scope statement, and we would begin to develop and I know Agile calls them features, but we would actually develop systems, subsystems, so ideas around how their requirements would be developed. What we would then do, there would be then a departure between the IT team, the vendor or the internal IT organization, and the client side, which is the subject matter experts. The design work would be done by IT, the development work would be done by IT, and the subject matter experts would be off perhaps beginning to develop their user test cases. They're beginning to be doing their own parallel work, perhaps putting together their training materials based on the requirements that was defined. And then at some point, they would all come back together. And on some of the projects I worked with, this coming back together might be a year later. And so this is, I think, where the Predictive and the Agile truly depart, because there is that danger. We haven't really seen each other for a year until suddenly we drop this system into the laps of our customers and say, now go away and test this. And there's not a true departure. I mean, we do have daily meetings still, and we still get together. And even during design, we're still asking questions. But truly, the client is not really seeing a product until the very end. And that could be a year later on a large project. So how's that for a long description of
that's great. That's great. And from an Agile standpoint, we've just put together a bunch of objectives and needs and expectations. We're not talking about requirements yet. and we've built these features like, you know, in a video game. The features may be a shield for a warrior, or a wand for a mage, and that kind of thing, right? And we have these things, and we may group these features into groups of work. We may have the shape of a box as one feature and the color of a box, and we turn around real quickly and we create prototypes based on the feedback from our stakeholders. So each one of these features we're using as exploration and doing early prototyping. The color of the box may be just a piece of paper with black paint on it. The size of the box may be just a paper prototype, right? So they can fit it where they think it's going to belong, and they can give us feedback real quickly. Now, at the same time, there are 3 meetings that are going on. At the beginning of the work, we have a stand-up that could be daily, weekly, monthly. It could be at the beginning of the feature. It could be the middle of the feature. We could put milestones wherever we want. It's basically, what did we do? Where are we now? And where are we going? It's progress, status, and forecast, and looking at issues and risks. So this is a common conversation we have. And this may be also what we're doing with the stakeholders as well, because they're heavily invested in getting this prototype refined quickly. There's another one called a retrospective, which is at the end of the day or the week or the month or the feature or the work. And that's what went really well, what didn't go as well, but could have gone better. And if we knew what we were getting into, how would we have done it differently now? So you're pulling all this information. Now, this is where Scrum actually inserts its value. Scrum talks about capturing these little pieces of information and putting them together. Okay, and those things that you put together are called a scrum of scrums for multiple features going on. And you dump that back into the backlog, either as a feature or a product backlog item itself, or you integrate it into the other features based on how it connects with the rest of the work. And at the same time, you're constantly prioritizing the work. You know, oh, these stakeholders over here told us it's really good that we get this done first. Well, they said you need to look at that. So let's put this on the shelf right now, and let's bring up this in priority, and we'll attack this right now. So it gives you a really good opportunity to figure out what's working and what's not. And like you said, we're aimed at, number one, figuring out if we can get something into their hands, whether it's a prototype or a functional model they can use in operations, or it's something that they really don't need. And this actually is an opportunity early in the project to say, we're off on the wrong direction, let's go in the correct direction.
So those, in order to be able to present those features to them, you have to do fairly short, we call them sprints in Agile, right? So you have to do these fairly short 2 or 3 or 4 week. Give me something at the end of that.
Right.
So,
there, everything is time boxed. We're not measuring in duration of work early in the project. We're measuring in density of work, how complicated it is, how uncertain our understanding of it is, how complex. Yeah.
So the part that I described earlier from a predictive standpoint, where we do our requirements gathering, we part for a while we do design and that sort of thing, come together maybe a year later and start testing and working together. That, in order to grab all of my features for that one long execution process, what you've described in Agile is you're doing all of that, but you're doing it in small pieces as you go along, every 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, depending on how long or what your time box duration happens to be.
Right. And we'll talk more about this in monitoring and controlling.
Okay.
But the objective is, with these small bite-sized chunks, what's the earliest we can get something functional in their hands they can actually use, and what's the earliest can they actually find value. There's a mantra in Agile. First you crawl, then you walk, and then you run. And early in the project, you're at the crawl phase, which says, like I said, we're explorers, we're exploring.
Well, I'll tell you, in the predictive, and I remember early in my career, I remember a couple of projects, and I'm going to say this out loud. I was not the project manager, but but I remember very distinctly, describing what I just did: requirements, design, development, and into testing, where we presented for testing to the user community, the end users, this project. And I've said this on this podcast before. They took one look at it and said, I know that's what we asked for, but it's not what we wanted. And I think having learned that, or having experienced that as an analyst, when I became a project manager, I began to think of ways, how can I keep the subject matter experts and my client team involved every single day? Now, we weren't as formal as what you just described with daily stand-up meetings and retrospectives, but we definitely kept them aligned with us. So as an example, when we went from requirements gathering, where we were all one team in a room for weeks on end, and then when we as an IT shop went away and did our design, we would bring them in every so often and say, okay, we're designing, we don't quite get this, we're not quite understanding, help us with this. So we would actually, during our design work, get input from the users while we were working along. And so in employing that, it wasn't Agile, it was still this long process, but we made sure that the client was with us all along the way. So I think there maybe some of that is similar to the two different approaches.
Communication is communication, and engagement is engagement. And we learned back in the 1990s and even in the 1970s, you can make things really cheaply, and you can make a lot of them, but that doesn't mean that people are going to buy them.
Yeah. And I think, I guess the other part of this is that because we like to keep our, as project managers, we like to have our Gantt charts on the wall, and we like to tick off, we like to draw lines. And every week we do our status report with a client, and we bring our stakeholder in, because typically our stakeholder involvement, besides being the person or persons we go to help us with risk mitigation, are also the people that we want to keep informed. So every week we draw our line on the Gantt chart saying we are up to here, this is what we need from you next week, etc. But in Agile, what I'm hearing is that stakeholder involvement it's kind of all one team. You're doing this all at the same time.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. It's a redefining of what we mean by team. In Predictive, the stakeholders who help you collect the requirements, they're part of your team. The stakeholders who are helping you with user acceptance testing, they're part of the team. And in Agile, there's nothing that's not part of the team. We're basically creating this mindset that if we're talking, you're influencing the project by giving us your ideas. Guess what? That means you're part of the team.
No, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Let's move on to monitoring controlling, because a lot of us understand that monitoring controlling are part of are actually working in parallel with the executing work, right?
Yeah, it is. And that's been my experience from the internal IT team, where you're managing and you're monitoring and controlling all along. Now, typically, I shouldn't say sometimes, typically, we would have an internal QA team as well that would come along behind us. If we were doing the development work, we would do peer code reviews. So we would have aspects of good predictive development work and design work that was part of what we would build in. The other part of my experience is often our customer was directed by their funding agencies to bring on an independent validation and verification team. And they would kind of look over our shoulder the entire time. So even though we had our own internal QA or quality assurance processes, they would impose a second set of quality assurance reviews and maybe even get involved in some of the testing. But yeah, typically the monitoring and controlling was in parallel with our execution.
Yeah, and that was my experience as well. Basically, the data is created by the work, and that data is analyzed by whomever and turned into information reports that we use to maintain control. And that's basically as simple as you can get. Now, that's the same way you do it in Agile as well, except what are the metrics or general indicators you use in monitoring, controlling a predictive project, Merv?
The biggest one we used obviously was the Gantt chart on the wall and our progress, but along with that came our estimates to complete. So we would go right down to the lowest level person on our project, the people who are truly in the trenches, and right down to the individual task base, and they would say, I've put this much effort in on this task, I've got this much left. And we would accumulate that all the way up to the top, and we would come up with a weekly estimate to complete is typically what we did, which worked itself into our earned value metrics. Later on, and I didn't get into this as much, but we had something called a SPI process, an SPI measurement, which also led to an understanding of where we were, if we were as close to our required progress against the Gantt chart or against the project plan. And so we would do that measurement as well. But typically estimates to complete was our bread and butter.
Yeah, schedule performance index is good when you're looking at velocity, how quickly you're going in comparison to plan. And that's basically miles per hour, right? And then you have your cost performance index, and that's your cost efficiency. And that's talking about miles per gallon. You know, how much work am I getting out of every dollar spent? Right. And those are the traditional measurements that you use in earned value. And everything else is around effort. You know, how much effort are we moving out of the way before we're done with the work?
Yeah. And it's an interesting process, because early in my career, I had managers who demanded that we look at every task. I've got a 40-hour task in front of me. I've put in 24. I still have 24 left, is how they expected me as a developer or designer to work. So now I'm 8 hours behind, according to that process. Well, as we went further and got a little more mature, they would kind of give these, well, if you've started, you're 25%. If you're partway through, you're 50%. So we would do these kind of rough orders of magnitude, so we didn't have to get into all of these measurements, because we'd have some developers that sit there, well, I don't know if I've got 5 hours left or 7 hours, I don't know. So anyway, we ended up simplifying it, but aggregated across the entire project, we would come pretty close to an understanding of what our earned value was on the project.
Wow, very cool.
How did you guys, what's the typical Agile methodology for measuring? Oh,
that's trouble, because you don't have any history sometimes. And so you have to start off with some type of benchmark, and that's where the time boxes come in. Remember, duration includes resources, right? And it's a time from start to end. And so you don't have that. What you have is little boxes of effort. And that's what the sprint is. The sprint is the measurement of effort, like 2 to 4 weeks of effort, 3 to 5 days of effort. And you define that for the features up front. The time boxes plus, how complex the work is, and how much uncertainty you're involved in. So you have the story points that are the measurement of complexity and uncertainty. And then you have the time boxes that talk about effort, but not duration. And then you can actually say, okay, this whole stack of features has this much effort. And that's where you get to your burn down. Now, if you can break these features into individual components you can work with in isolation. You can put up a task board, and you can create a Kanban that says, I'm going to put my features in on one side. I'm going to run them through a bunch of recognizable steps, and they're going to come out on the other end. And so if I know how quickly it takes a box of features to go through that work, and it's going to take me a couple, 3 iterations, then I can get an average velocity for this project. Now, that's my velocity. That's my schedule performance index. I'm using the progress on my project instead of my planned progress for my variance, progress to actual. Second of all, it also allows me to take that progress back to my uncertainty and be able to refine my estimates as I go through. And we're talking with the stakeholders to get a better idea of what they need. We're working before the work and after the work, capturing different sets of data. And so we can actually make changes to the individual features and the individual backlog as we go through.
Well, and I was thinking as you're describing that I imagine after 2 or 3 or 4 sprints, the team gets sort of a natural synergy and a natural cadence, so that what happened in the first couple of sprints is no longer the velocity of the 4th or 5th or 6th sprints. You're probably producing at a much faster, more quality rate than you were at the beginning.
And there's a lot more confidence involved and that actually assists in that increase of accuracy and precision, we might say.
But I have a different question for you, and see if there's a huge departure here. In predictive, because we've developed our scope and we've refined it during requirements gathering, so that, don't give me 3 more reports. Now you're out of scope, right? I mean, that's more work that I hadn't planned for in my budget. And so I have a way of dealing with that in terms of a formalized change order or change request process. What you described earlier with backlogs, and we didn't get so much into necessarily during the sprints, that you can drop features out if you find that you're not going to make it in your time box, and add them to the backlog and bring them back later. But as I understand Agile, and if you're really kind of plucking things out of backlog or putting things back into backlog, where's the change request? Because there really is no change.
So let's put it this way.
Yeah.
What we think of as change requests are not the change control system. They're a component of the change control system. So we do have to have some sense of formal change control in Agile. Now, the change requests are great. They don't go away. It's basically how they get entered into the process of being approved, applied, and validated. And that's the key. The problem is, you gave clues to where the real problem is. In the mid-2000s, all of a sudden, a white paper showed up saying, why does Agile fail so much? And it all pointed to executives. The executive oversight and authorization required total commitment to -3 to +5% accuracy in your estimates throughout the life of the project. And that cannot be done. That's not part of the physical universe. We have a conflict of constraints when we get to that, especially when we say that scope can be very flexible. And that's what the intention of Agile was. Maybe we need to deviate from a whole phase and approach it from a whole different manner in order to make this work. And in order to do that in predictive, you had to set expectations early and talk about risk. In Agile, you have to talk about the way we work together, the way we have our mindsets, and the way we build relationships so we have trust. And executives don't have time to build individual trust. So this is the great deviation. How do I get my executives bought into this process that they want to black box, but they need to know every detail?
Well, and from my own experience, I wouldn't necessarily say that a lot of project failures that I was aware of were also not part of the problem because of senior executives not being involved. Or what would happen is they would become involved later in the game and second guess what had gone on before, those sorts of things. So, whether it's Agile as you described it, or I think in Predictive, I strongly believe, and that's why I think that the PMBOK or the PMI added that whole process of stakeholder engagement. We need to keep those decision makers and those subject matter experts and the people who are truly going to be living with this product when we leave. We need to keep them engaged the whole time. And shame on us as IT people if we don't keep them engaged, because the failure then, yes, it's because of their lack of engagement, but it's because that we did not keep them engaged.
Right. We did not assess the value of the project. We did not assess their expectations, and we didn't assess the culture. And so in the mid to late 2000s, there was an understanding that this was not necessarily a failure in business, but a failure in understanding human behavior. So that there is an understanding that executives own the culture, and the culture must learn to adapt to a different mindset and a different approach to the way we work.
Yeah, I still remember, I'm going to tell this little story here, is we had a situation where it was a very large project. It was measured in the over $100 million size. So it was a fairly large project. And we were able to convince the organization that we were working for to allow us access to the number 2 person in the organization, to be at our, not at our beck and call sounds a little primitive, but to be there to move obstacles out of our way on the client side, to be there to guide us, to the point where in our project offices, we put a separate office for this person and asked that she be there 2 to 3 days a week to be with us. And that stakeholder engagement was so important to us. Probably my most successful project that I had ever worked on, in terms of coming in on time, coming in under budget, and coming in with a full set of features that the client had asked for in their request for proposal. But I think I attributed it to that person who was not only there on premise, but who was there to do the work and to make sure it succeeded along with us.
That is a hallmark of a good project right there.
Yeah, absolutely. And kudos to that organization for letting its number 2 executive become part of our team to that extent. So many organizations can't afford that. They just can't make that happen. So
right.
So I think we've got a few minutes left. Should we tackle closing?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. And I think we can do it. We've been talking about closing and giving little bits of information throughout. And let's talk about the big picture, and then we can talk about the small picture. You said predictive is a delivery at the end.
It is, but it's also a delivery in phases. So when I was talking about the execution, typically at the end of the planning phase is a major deliverable consisting of several plans. At the end of the execution phase, maybe not even the end, maybe partway through, there's a requirements deliverable, a design deliverable, and then your modules that you've developed. So at each of these phases, there are sort of major milestones that in my mind become sort of major or interim closings, if you will. Because what happens is if I don't get the requirements right and approved by my client, it's difficult to move on to design. If my design is not completed to the satisfaction of my internal or external quality assurance organization, it's difficult to move to development. So there are sort of those mini closings, mini approvals before I get to the end of the project.
And that's why in the framework, we talk about close project or phase. And we have those milestone closes also, but we have releases too that are not just releases to the client, which have authorization on them, but we actually have releases into production that are iterative and incremental. And that's the ability that you have. We've talked in the last few weeks, right? Launching a website with basic functionality to get it out there and to make sure it's what the people like and it's going to be used. We've talked about the phone where we have incremental releases too. And this is the mindset of Agile. What's the smallest amount of functionality I can get in people's hands and start having them use it to demonstrate usability? And also, what's the smallest increment of value I can get out there so they can start understanding how impactful this product is as well.
Well, and think the major advantage in my mind to what you just described is think of even from a training perspective, instead of developing these huge training modules or the whole organizational change management process towards the end of the project, you can sort of deliver it as you implement and put into production these smaller pieces. So you're training on a module as opposed to the entire system. You're training a smaller group of users using that module as opposed to your entire end user population. So even from the people side, the human capital side, it's a huge advantage, I think, to do Agile in that way.
Correct. Yeah, and I think we've nailed it. That's the beauty of it. And again, let's agree that Agile grew up and matured in the software industry where we have beta launches and we have beta testing, and it stands to reason to be able to do this. But at the same time, this works really well in operations and in the marketplace and in other parts of business. And that's why Agile's been embraced so aggressively.
Well, and I think the other thing, and this is probably somewhere where Agile and Predictive come together very strongly, is at the end of every one of those closings I talked about, or even as we approach those milestones, the beauty of the whole idea is to start to collect our lessons learned and start to document those. I think Agile probably does the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lessons learned are collected, and we also have issues. We also have what else do we have? Assumptions and constraints.
Yeah.
All of the stuff that we learned as good practice in project management doesn't go away. But because of the nature of the work, we have to approach it in such a way that we have to stay limber, and we have to make sure that people understand, what's going on and how quickly things change. So they in predictive projects, they don't talk about information radiators. But in Agile, they say things are changing so quickly. We're going to put a terminal up here in the lab, and that's going to be the dashboard that we're going to track. And then the other part of the screen is the backlog. And if you want to actually go in and play with this, we have a mock-up in our war room on the whiteboard. And so we have that inundation of information and the authorization to go in and negotiate. And this is the final thing too. As project manager, I was trained to negotiate, to persuade, to have a lot of emotional intelligence and self-awareness. And now the training material is saying, no, everybody gets to do this. Yeah. It's not just this project manager.
So the project manager is no longer kind of the major project director, big boss kind of thing. The project manager, he or she, is part of the team. It's just
right. It's a collaborative role, and it's mostly facilitative.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, I have enjoyed today's discussion. If anything, just to relive my days as a project manager and in the predictive lifestyle that I once led. So, and thank you for also helping us and our audience understand a little bit more about the Agile process and the comparison between the two.
Well,
Neither's
thank you.
right, neither's wrong, neither's, they all have their
And again, I want to reiterate, I'm not an expert. I've done this and I teach it. I'm nowhere near as an expert. And I consider you as much an expert in Agile just because of the way you describe your approach to work and your experience.
Well, and you said it before, and I shouldn't have let you get away with this because I should be the one saying this. Communication, communication, it doesn't matter if you're using predictive, hybrid, if I can use that term, Agile, or whatever it is, you need to communicate all the time. So,
right.
Speaking of communication, if someone wants to communicate with you, Tim, where will they find you?
Over on LinkedIn. And in the next few weeks, you'll see me exposing my public face in other media channels too. But for right now, if you need to reach with me to me for any comments or questions, I'm in as Tim or Timothy, and you can find me quite easily.
Right. And same thing for me. It's Merv Jersak on my LinkedIn profile. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook and places like that. But LinkedIn seems to be the place where we as professionals kind of get our traction in this whole thing that we're doing. So until next time, Tim, thank you again for this discussion. It was enlightening and it was great.
Yes, it was. Thank you, Merv. It's a privilege.
All right. We'll see you in a week. Same time, same channel.
Thanks again.